No. Mrs. Post, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, my name is Raya Post, and I am a Roma woman from Sweden belonging to the Sinti group, and I was born condemned. I have been a human rights activist for 40 years. So in 2014, when I got elected to represent the Swedish Feministic Initiative, I took on the mission of safeguarding the principles of democracy, of spreading and defending fundamental human rights, gender equality, and the respect of the basic values of our EU treaties. One of my goals with this report is to place the situation of the Roma on the political agenda and to make real, tangible change at last. The EU is at a very critical point at the moment, and the destiny of 12 million people is not a priority. This clearly goes against the values of the EU, but this neglect is not a new phenomenon. It has been going on for 800 years. And the result is that now, in 2017, the situation of the Roma people is not better than in third countries. And as I said, following my mission, I want to fight against injustice and inequality. And this is not an easy task. The last time we had a debate on Roma issue in this chamber in April, 3 MEPs took the opportunity to spread hate speech. And although we had strengthened the rules of procedure of the European Parliament, the President of the European Parliament failed to react, failed to condemn and sanction hate speech. I was not very surprised by it. Roma people have been neglected, discriminated against, stigmatized, excluded and dehumanized for 800 years. We have never been good enough for the European societies to accept us as equal citizens with a guarantee equal access to our fundamental human rights. The result is clear to see in all the shocking reports of FRA and NGOs. Anti-gypsies, the specific form of racism directed against the Roma, was first recognized in the European Parliament in 2015 through our resolution. Anti-gypsies, however unconscious it might be, can be revealed in the EU acquis as well, which often fails to take into consideration the realities and challenges of Roma, who are unable to enjoy the same rights and opportunities and the same level of protection as other EU citizens. Until we manage to remedy anti-gypsies, the root cause of the unacceptable situation that Roma are still facing in Europe in 2017, we will not see improvement, even if the European Commission initiates good programs. Is there a need to improve this situation? Yes. Is there a way to improve this situation? Yes. Is there a way out of mistrust from both sides? Yes, of course there is. My report, which has been the first EP report addressing anti-gypsies at a wide scale, lists 12 pages of demands and recommendations, from which I will only mention a few of them. We demand the setting up of truth and reconciliation commissions at member states and at EU level to acknowledge the persecution, exclusion and disownment of Roma throughout the centuries, to document this in an official white paper and to make the history of Roma part of the curricula in schools, which is crucial for creating trust. We deplore the violation of the right of Roma to free movement. We also call on the member states of origin to take their responsibility, combat poverty and exclusion of all their citizens, and on the member states of arrival to increase cooperation across borders to combat discrimination and exploitation and prevent exclusion continuing in the country of arrival. We demand active, meaningful participation for Roma at all levels. We call on the Court of Auditors to check the performance of EU programs, as they seem to fail to reach out the most disadvantaged. We call for compensation for Roma women having been subject to forced sterilization. We call for the continuation of an improved EU framework for national Roma integration strategies after 2020. We call on the Commission for the introduction of anti-discrimination indicators in the field of education, employment, housing and health, as anti-gypsies undermines the successful implementation of the national Roma strategies. And we call on the Commission to treat anti-gypsies as a horizontal issue and develop an inventory of practical steps to combat anti-gypsies. Thank you.
Grazie, grazie.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Post. I now give the floor to Commissioner Malmström. Go ahead, please.
Presidente. I would like to start, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, by thanking the rapporteur and the Parliament for the continued support to the Roma integration process. The 2011 resolution of the European Parliament played a key role in launching of the EU framework for national Roma integration strategies up to 2020. And today I want to particularly thank Soraya Post for your relentless, tireless work in this field, not only in this report, but for the work you do in general. This report, as the rapporteur says, rightly highlights anti-Gypsyism, which is being felt in our society through anti-Roma hate speech, growing trends of segregation and forced evictions. Anti-Gypsyism and socio-economic exclusion go hand in hand, so we must tackle these together. And many parts of the reform of the report confirm the conclusions we also made in the mid-term review. Improvements in education. This is key, of course. Fewer Roma leave school early and more Roma children participate actually today in early childhood education. However, segregation in education has persisted and the situation has deteriorated. In several member states, the majority of Roma children attend classes where most or almost all classmates are Roma. Educating Roma children in segregated settings prevents them from equal chances to participate in later higher quality education and access to the labour market. And this is why the Commission launched infringements to ensure effective equal access for Roma to a quality, inclusive mainstream education. I am also grateful that the report recognises existing efforts and calls for continued action from the Commission side in several areas. For instance, it explicitly calls for the extension of the joint programme on access of Roma and traveller women to justice, piloted since last year in 5 member states by the Commission and the Council of Europe. The aim is to empower Roma women, improve their access to justice and fight the multifaceted discrimination that they encounter. These are all priority areas highlighted by the report. The report's call for setting up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is welcome. These bodies, focusing on national histories and engaging directly with societies, are of course best placed in national levels. This process should be Roma-led, with the involvement of other stakeholders as well. Thus, and given its mandate, the newly set up European Roma Institute of Arts and Culture could be well positioned rather than the Commission to play a leading role in this process, and we are of course ready to support this. So there are many very valuable proposals in this report, Mr. President, honourable members. We would like to thank again the rapporteur and the committee for the work that you have done and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Malmström. We'll now hear from the Women's Committee. Mrs. Björk, please, 1 minute. Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking Soraya because we are lucky to have somebody such as her in the Parliament working on this dossier. And I'm very glad to have been able to work with her on this point in the committee. We've also been able to focus on the issues of young women, girls as well, and women, and often they suffer most, and it's utterly unacceptable, as is the lack of political action on this point, and that's what this report is trying to address. In the Gender Equality Committee, we're trying to do something about this, and I think it's very important that we take a political stand on this, so that we provide the support in terms of rights, in terms of health for these people. Also, it's about children having the right to go to school, or when adults are seeking work. And women in this are a key priority. It's a structural problem that we're trying to address here with this anti-gypsyism. And it's, I think, certainly not good that that exists. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to hear from Mr. Saki from the EPP. 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, President. On behalf of the European People's Party, I welcome this report. I believe it's extremely important that this report was framed here in the European Parliament, and I would like to thank Ms. Post for the collaborative work we've engaged in on that. The European People's Party took a most active part in the work of this report and tabled a number of amendments, in part shaping the current form of the report. It's a fresh approach to our Roma policy, and this has been an issue in the member states for decades now. People have had different conceptual approaches, but we're still waiting for tangible results. The European dimension hasn't actually met expectations either. But without it, things would be a lot worse. The report we're looking at today is different from the previous ones because we're looking at the phenomenon of anti-gypsyism. If we do not take action against anti-gypsyism, the other measures will remain ineffective. Education, health, housing, for example. And anti-gypsyism is so deep-seated in our societies that these other policy measures will not be able to make a difference while it persists. And we need to point out that this is a particularly striking issue in Central and Eastern Europe, and I've discussed matters with Czech and Slovakian experts. And I'd like to point out that it was very important for me that the region be centre stage, and we need to work together on it.
Thank you very much. And now for the S&D group, Mr. Weidenholzer. 2 minutes, please.
Thanks very much. This is a very important indeed debate. The Roma and Sinti are the biggest ethnic minorities in Europe. 20 million of them live in the member states. So they are the only pan-European minority. Many member states have fewer. For many generations, Roma have been discriminated against. During the Nazi time, they were victims of the Holocaust, which is something we don't talk about enough. Europe, therefore, has a political obligation towards this group of people. In addition to the obligations in the Fundamental Rights Charter against these people, we need to do more. And I think Mrs. Post's report is most timely. It has a good approach, and the task of integrating the Roma is something which we must see from the optic of fundamental rights. But it's about far more than just social policy measures which are insufficiently funded. No, we need an inclusive, holistic approach which will see the Roma as a part of the population with equal rights, treated with equality, without any discrimination. Now, there is attempts to play Roma off against our own poor. This is something which must be stopped. In training, in the labour market, or in housing, there is discrimination. And I think in tackling these problems for Roma, we must use the same approach as for all others. We must thank Mrs. Post for this approach and for making these proposals. The civilizational progress of a country, colleagues, can be measured on the basis of how these countries or a country deals with its Roma minority. And I think there's too much to be done. And above all, we must fight against any kind of anti-Roma actions or behaviour. Thank you.
Thank you. And now for the ECR, Mr. Škripek. 1 minute, 30 seconds, please.
Pán predsedajúci, oceňujem vznik tejto správy. Ďakujem aj pani Soraya Post.
Thank you. I would like to praise this report, and I would like to thank Mrs. Soraya Post for the trouble she's gone to prepare this report, and the fact that we've been able to agree on compromise amendments. As a shadow rapporteur, I of course understand that we need to fight against discrimination, and I also understand it because we have this community of people in Slovakia. I've had personal contact with these people, I've actually worked with them, and I've seen a number of things. I'd like to perhaps emphasize a couple of points. I mean, in the eyes of God, we are all the same in terms of our human dignity, and the situation of the Roma in Europe, you know, we need to make sure that they are very much linked to Europe. We need to pay far more attention to this community. We need to make sure that these people feel integrated in our union, in our member states. And we have a big problem in that regard in Slovakia. We're a small country, we have a large Roma community, and nevertheless, my point of view is the following. This report, will it actually have an influence on the life of the Roma community? I wonder, because it doesn't talk about them engaging with the majority community, I'm afraid. I think that they need to know how they should engage with the community as a whole. We have some good examples where the Roma people have fought for their own lives, for their own fate, and then we've seen some results. There are great opportunities. These opportunities have been seized upon by the people themselves, and it's been very helpful. It's been a source of hope. It's a hope not just for their community but also for others. So I look forward to a time where this is no longer a problem, where it's actually a solution for unemployment, and where we can solve these problems together.
Thank you. Mrs. Albiol Guzman now, 1.5 minutes. The reality is that Roma continue to suffer from discrimination and racism in our countries. Discrimination when it comes to access to housing, segregation in schools in countries such as Hungary, Bulgaria, Slovakia is up to 60%. There are higher imprisonment rates, forced sterilisation. All of these aren't one-off specific cases. Anti-gypsyism impregnates our society and also our European and state institutions, as well as the media. Look at Spain, for example. Television programs such as the Gypsy Kings show major gypsy weddings, and they maintain stereotypes and foster discourse of hate. Anti-Gypsyism is a systemic form of racism. And we need to be aware of that so that we can change the focus of our policies. It's essential to do away with austerity policies and cuts to public services which guarantee equality. We will never achieve equality if the state doesn't put in place those mechanisms to guarantee it. Now, when it comes to the fight against Romaphobia, that has to start here in this Parliament. All too often we've heard speeches that stigmatise Roma, even calling for violence, without subsequently there being any kind of condemnation coming from this House. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was on behalf of the GUI NGL group. So now on behalf of the Green group, Mrs. Valero, will you have 1 minute?
Thank you very much, Madam President. I too would like to start off by thanking Soraya for an excellent report, and also thank you to the shadow rapporteurs for this good cooperation. We have a lot to be ashamed of in Europe when it comes to the way in which we've dealt with and continue to deal with the Roma community, and that's why it's so important for us to draw attention to this in the Member States, in the Commission, but also ourselves, the prejudices that we've learnt, unfortunately, almost innately. We need to understand where they come from in order to change things. We also need to understand that this discrimination against the Roma community that's been going on for a long, long time has a cost. we first of all should apologise. That's the first thing, to say sorry, and we need to find a way of creating trust and of somehow finding reconciliation. For instance, when we have Holocaust Day in August, I think it's important to also remember this community. There's a lot to be done in the world and in Europe. Today's debate will not solve the Roma community's problems, but it is a step in the right direction towards a more accepting Europe where Roma people are not discriminated against, dealt with in a different way, and member states should make sure that all citizens have the same treatment. In order to get results, we need strong legislation. We have a number of conventions already. We also have, of course, the basic principles and values of the EU. What about economic incentives? They haven't helped so far, but I think that we need to work further, not only on that, but also on attitudes, change the mindset in the majority community.
Thank you. Mrs. Valero, there's a blue card for you from Mrs. Shodrova. Will you accept that blue card? Please, Mrs. Shodrova.
Paní kolegyně, já souhlasím s tím, že
Distinguished colleagues, I do agree that there is lots of room for improvement, but we should not be ashamed. Here I do not agree with you. Mr. Skripek pointed out that a lot of things have been done well. So do you feel we need to be ashamed? You don't have any single example of good practice. Nothing is done against the Roma discrimination.
Well, of course, there are lots of examples of best practices. In Sweden, for instance, we've been very active when it comes to working with the white paper, but let's not forget that we have 800 years, perhaps more, behind us that we should be ashamed of, and we still haven't really faced our history, faced up to it. Forced sterilisation and other such examples. I'm afraid in some countries, in some cases, we have taken a step to try to move towards some kind of closure, but there's still a lot that remains to be done. So yes, there are good things, there are good examples, there's a lot going on, but there's still a lot that we should be ashamed of, and we still haven't apologised for it.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes now, Mr. Le Breton on behalf of the ENF Group.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much. The Roma very often give rise to a feeling of rejection in Europe. They're victims of discrimination in many member states, but they've been in Europe for centuries, and their ancestors came from India. They came and they were the Mongols, but they have never become fully integrated. So Mrs. Post is quite rightly worried about their fate. Some of her proposals and recommendations are very reasonable. The condemnation of barbaric customs such as forced sterilization of Roma women or withdrawal of Roma children from their parents. She is also asking the European Union to deprive some member states that persecute the Roma of funds. For instance, the Roma should not pose an attack on the freedom of expression of MEPs. And then the idea of assimilating Roma, she calls this paternalistic treatment of Roma in our society. I am in favor of integrating the Roman in the member state in which they live, because I think otherwise our societies will remain fragmented. One has to respect the Roma, and that means that you have to include them, assimilate them, and not to condemn them forevermore to remain a separate ethnic group.
2 minutes. 2 minutes now, Mrs. Zaborska, please.
Madame la Présidente, Madame la Commissaire.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. Well, I'm very pleased that this report also mentions the historical guilt of the majority vis-à-vis the Roma. It's very important for us to recall the centuries of prejudice and violence that have been committed on the Roma, beginning with the pogroms and then moving on to the extermination camps. It's only by knowing our history that younger generations can understand that the majority bears a burden of guilt for the current situation. There are always marginalized communities in many member states, and the pictures that we see of lives lived in extreme poverty really actually even serve to increase prejudices and the problems that the Roma minority subsequently have. Children, for example, when they're born in extreme poverty, barely have the opportunity to get an appropriate education and a good job. And so, therefore, greater efforts have to be made to integrate these marginalised communities. And here I don't just mean the Roma, I mean all marginalised communities who aren't able to take control of their own destiny. Yes, we need to remember the past, process it, but this should be take place independently of integration which should be aimed at all people. The European Union has the duty to ensure that everyone can live in dignity and that their dignity be respected, whether they live in Slovakia, Hungary, France, or whether they're a Roma. Thank you. Now, Mr. Lopez Aguilar, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner. It is true that the Gypsy people represent 20 million people on European territory, and historically they have been affected and tagged with very humbling stereotypes. They're stigmatized, they are not educated, they're subject to social conflict, etc. And here we have been witness to this sort of prejudice. We have heard some speeches really which should have been sanctioned by Parliament immediately, but that discourse, that rhetoric has contributed to their social exclusion. It is therefore indispensable to try once more and integrate the Roma people and the Gypsy people in our communities, generate jobs for them, educate them, try and include them in our societies, especially the most vulnerable groups, women, minors, who suffer doubly from social exclusion. I would like to thank what our colleague Soraya Post has done. Her commitment is an honor to this Parliament. She fights against all sorts of Romophobia.
Mr. Vistisen, now 1 minute.
The challenge surrounding the Roma community in Europe is historic. It's also a deep challenge, but it doesn't change the fact that this is primarily a domestic remit, a national task for us. It's something that needs to be dealt with by our nation states. That remains a fact. And even if, from an EU perspective, we have already tried to find various solutions to this problem, I'm afraid we haven't got as far as we should have. So I think we need to pause for thought. You know, is it actually true to say that we need more, that we need to do more in order to improve integration in our individual member states? I wonder. Now, I come from Denmark. Historically speaking, we haven't really had a Roma community. What I've noticed is that there is an abuse of EU laws and regulations by a certain group of Roma people who come to Denmark who have no real desire to work, who are actually using the system in order to be able to stay in Denmark, and that is not acceptable, and it is not something that we should accept as European Union either.
2 minutes, je passe la parole à Madame.
Let me now give the floor to Mrs. Sojdrova, 2 minutes.
Well, colleagues, Roma are citizens just like us, and I personally have many friends among them. They have their tradition, their language, their mentality is a bit different, but what's the main thing? Their duties and their rights are equal to our duties and rights. I am aware that their integration lags behind in some areas. There are obstacles that we know about. They are often issues at both sides. It's a matter, of course, that it's the member states who has the main deal of responsibility, and the European Parliament is right to turn to member states with a long list of proposals how to improve the situation, particularly where things are not going as they should. On the other hand, this report is so negative. Sometimes it looks like member states just passively tolerate the discrimination. That's not really true, and I disagree on behalf of the Czech Republic. I personally was involved for 3 years in a project dealing with the quality of education education, and I was monitoring disadvantaged children. I can confirm that some young Roma children are disadvantaged and discriminated, but it's mainly due to their parents not taking them to school, not sending them to kindergarten. I'm not saying it's always the case. It is changing, but if Roma children are not being sent to school, they can't be successful. They often drop out early. In order to prevent that, what we did is we introduced obligatory kindergarten from 5 years of age, and we've got special measures to integrate those children. We changed the legislation and we added some money so that these children can have a better start in life than their parents. This year, Czech government has decided to buy a pig farm in Lety and to create a special Holocaust memorial place. Yes, we have to be sufficiently courageous to criticize, but you also have to point out the good that has been done.
Pardon. Pour une minute, je passe la parole à...
Now, let me give the floor to Mr. Niedermüller for 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We all know that the most exploited and most disadvantaged minority that we have in Europe is also the largest minority in Europe, the largest minority altogether. We're talking about the Roma population in the EU. They are citizens of the EU just like any other citizen, and yet the way in which they are treated, the circumstances under which they live, are completely unacceptable. If a government wants to, they can resettle the Roma community, they can put children in segregated classes, and in fact social benefits can be withdrawn quite arbitrarily from Roma families, and nobody, hardly anybody, speaks up for them. Now, when it comes to the Roma community, the EU does not really provide help and support and shelter, but rather adds to the problem. And we've said so many times that this is unacceptable, morally speaking and politically speaking. It is unacceptable, and yet nothing is being done. All we really need to do is respect human dignity. The host community needs to create the right circumstances, and of course the Roma community should be well integrated into our countries. Thank you.
Let me now give the floor to Mr. Jambatsky for 1 minute.
Mrs. President, ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Post, I think this report is extremely one-sided and imbalanced. Many member states are being criticized. You say there is a lot of prejudice, there is not enough housing, the Roma people's rights are being trampled upon. I do not agree to this basic one-size-fits-all approach. Let me just give some examples. Discrimination as far as housing is concerned. Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever heard of private property? How would you react if someone started living in your apartment? 40% of the people who answered the survey, you say, Mrs. Post, face street dogs and need to climb walls and so on and so forth. Is it serious? I don't think it is. Some hospitals, you continue, in Romania and Bulgaria have maternity wards which are segregated. You need to prove this. Forceful sterilization. This is a blatant lie. Ladies and gentlemen, this looks like Orwell. This is a cultural Marxism and a Bolshevism, and it is inadmissible.
Let me now give the floor to Mrs. Koszłowska for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, President, ladies and gentlemen. The discrimination against Roma is a fact, and it is a shameful fact. Despite dedicated programs and dedicated policies and spent funds, we have not reached satisfactory results that we expected. The Roma community, or at least a large part of it, still is unemployed and lives under very bad conditions, and this report describes it quite well. There is a lot of figures that describe the current situation. And all these deficiencies are also actually compounded by prejudices, and this is a vicious circle that is very difficult to break, but the Roma history and the Roma Holocaust obviously should not just be discussed by experts, but should just be a part of our lives. That is why I'm very satisfied with the report that we are discussing today, that represents a new approach and a new kind of language
about the Roma that encourages the Member States and the Commission to build mutual trust. I think this is a key to understand this report and its message. This report has the purpose of actively involving the Roma in social and cultural life and economic life, and provides for inclusion of consultations with the communities and educating young leaders of Roma communities, and also mostly to go from a very paternalistic approach to a partnership approach. So I think there should be an audit of all the programs in the Member States that are carried out with full engagement, have been carried out for years. I think they should be assessed and look at why they are not as successful as we would like them to be, and maybe look for new solutions by also including the Roma beneficiaries in the assessment. Thank you very much.
Merci. La parole.
Thank you. Let me now give the floor to Mr. Sogor for 1.5 minutes.
This report is one that really looks in a detailed way at the whole process of Roma integration and also anti-gypsyism. I would like to draw particular attention to the Commission's call for practical examples and practical measures to deal with anti-gypsyism, and also the fact that Member States should base their programs on Roma integration on successful local examples and programs. I think that every country really should develop methods that are suitable for its context. In Romania, we've had significant progress in that we've managed to decrease the number of primary school leavers, but that is not enough. It's insufficient unless we extend this effort up to the 10th year, because completing 10 years of schooling is necessary to get any kind of job. Also, students should not be there to support their families. We need to involve more Roma experts. We need to have school mediators from the Roma community. All of this is necessary. And I also think that our intervention plan should not look at the individual, but rather at families, because otherwise there's a kind of symbiosis between support for childcare and support for families. I would also suggest that the entire community be brought on board when it comes to our efforts to integrate the Roma community, because if you fail to do that, you could actually generate conflicts. And at the same time, social support should really be looking at integration onto the labour market. We should be actively promoting that, because that is the only way of saving people from the trap of passive support. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. I was looking for a visual response. You weren't on the list, but I imagined you wanted to take the floor during Catch the Eye. So, Mrs. Yorka, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and thank you to the Commissioner for your kind words. Mrs. Malmström, I'm so pleased to see you here. You've helped us a lot in the past with this strategy. We knew already then that digitalisation was a sine qua non if we wanted to deal with anti-gypsy sentiment, to make sure that we really were active against anti-gypsyism. And I would therefore suggest that we continue with this process with ECRI and with other organisations. I think we need to have digital opportunities to signal or to alert people to incidents that are anti-gypsy. I mean, for instance, my parents met at a common place of work, but those opportunities no longer seem to exist. There don't seem to be places in schools or in jobs where people can meet from different communities. The Roma community, they're not Indians, by the way, they are Europeans. We have a right to education. We have a right also to be able to teach our children in our own language. And in addition to that, I think it would be important for us to look at those countries where there really is strong anti-Roma sentiment. At the time, the Hungarian Guard was a reason why Hungary came under attack from the rest of the EU. We put an end to the Hungarian Guard, but I think it's important for us to look towards other member states as well, because, you know, these kind of extremist movements exist elsewhere too, and they are frightening.
Non, la parole.
Mrs. Ward now, 1 minute.
Oui.
Thank you. Roma across Europe, including in my country, face countless problems such as unemployment, poor access to public services, notably education, health and housing, multiple forms of discrimination and social, cultural and economic exclusion. This situation has worsened in the UK since the referendum, with Roma children in Manchester, for example, too afraid to play outdoors because of racist attacks. I fully support Soraya Post's position and agree that the problems related to Roma discrimination must be addressed through a rights-based approach. We're talking about the respect of human rights of Roma people who have been living in Europe for centuries. The EU has a responsibility to go beyond the social inclusion aspect. We need a global strategy and a transversal approach if we really want to make a difference. And I want to focus particularly on Roma women who find themselves at the intersection between anti-gypsyism and sexism. And as a founder of the Eli Wiesel Parliamentary Network to raise awareness of genocide, I particularly welcome Soraya's call for a truth commission on the Roma Holocaust.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you. Mr. Marias, please.
Thank you very much. Anti-Gypsyism is unfortunately present in many member states of the European Union. There are stereotypes very difficult to overcome, and let's not forget the dozens of pogroms against the Roma population, and let us not lose sight either of the millions of Roma people that were assassinated in the Nazi concentration camps. So we need to confront these problems. We need to overcome these stereotypes and eliminate them. We need to include and integrate the Roma community in society. The Roma community, too, must shoulder its responsibilities. It should not let itself be used by different political parties for electoral gain. They should not be victims of those that use the funds allocated them.
I
think with Mr. Yavor we would have given the floor to everyone present in the chamber. So you have the floor, please, sir.
Thank you very much, Madam President. First and foremost, allow me to thank Soraya Post for her excellent report. And thank you also for defending the Roma cause. Thank you for your cooperation in that regard. I also wanted to draw your attention to something in this report, because during the course of today's debate we've heard various opinions. For instance, the Commission or the EU institutions should not interfere with what's happening in the Member States. It's up to the Member States. You know, the EU shouldn't really interfere at all because it's something that doesn't fall within their remit. But the Commission does intervene in various ways. For instance, when it comes to EU funds being earmarked for this particular cause. That's one thing. Now that money, and we're talking about EU taxpayers' money, which is being used by the member states of the European Union for Roma integration, well, very often that money unfortunately does not reach its proper destination. It doesn't actually get to the most vulnerable groups. It's not being used properly or adequately by the member states, and therefore I would urge the Commission to do whatever it can in order to make sure that that money is deployed as it should and really for the benefit of the Roma community. Thank you.
Thank you. So that concludes the Catch the Eye procedure, and that brings us back to you, Mrs. Malmström.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it is extremely timely that we have this comprehensive report on anti-Gypsyism, and also not only describing the problem but also coming with concrete ideas. The Commission supports the creation and the development of national Roma platforms to ensure inclusive involvement of stakeholders in implementation but also in the monitoring. And as you know, this year we launched the Roma Civil Monitor project, and it's supposed to promote civil society capacity building. And today over 90 NGOs are involved. Roma participation here are of course a key element. We also support the efforts of the European Parliament and the proposal in the report to commemorate Roma Holocaust, and we have called upon Member States to do this commemoration the 2nd of August. As you know, the Commission has participated in several events, the 2nd of August but also the 27th of January, which is the Holocaust Memorial Day, in order to commemorate the victims of Roma Holocaust, and I think that would be a good thing. There has been lately efforts to try to improve the effectiveness of the different funds with increased Roma participation, and of course also increased efforts to make sure that they reach the intended recipients and to fight fraud in this regard. As you know, we have a variety of legal tools to fight discrimination and hate speech, and we will continue. These are good, they are very good, and we will continue to open infringement proceedings against those countries who do discriminate, for instance, Roma children in education. We have a few other cases as well that we are looking at, and we will continue to do so. That is the role of the Commission, and we will take that role very seriously. So, we do have tools in many ways, but as Mrs. Post so correctly says, legal tools, laws, all that is important, but the most important is the attitudes. So we need to keep on fighting, of course, hate speech and pure discrimination. That goes without saying. But also very important is the awareness raising, the information, the education, the inclusion, and also take measures to prevent the daily life, the daily prejudices, the stereotypes that are also something that then leads to hate speech and hate crime. So in this fight there are a lot of things to do, but I think the report is a very important tool, and I'd like to thank Mrs. Post for the work that she has done. Thank you very much.
Merci. On parlait de vous.
Thank you. Mrs. Post, then I'll give you the floor to conclude this debate.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all for your comments and for all the dedicated work, of course. And I would also like to show my gratitude to also my shadows, Bodil Valero, Cecilia Wikström, Marina Albiol, Paul Chaki, and Branislav Schlipek, their advisors and assistants, and the Libe Secretariat. And also, I would like to say thank you to the FAM committee who gave a lot of inputs, so I feel very comfortable not to put my energy on all that, because I know you will do your work. And I'm also very grateful for the input received from experts and NGOs who are working day by day to make the desperately needed changes. It is our obligation as politicians to safeguard the human rights of all people. Otherwise, we cannot uphold the values of the EU or talk about democracy. All EU citizens have a responsibility to act and to react to injustice. We have to show will and commitment to make a change. 12 million Roma are considered as second-class citizens, and 800 years of human rights deprivation and harassment is enough. We cannot stay in the Middle Age, 2017. I hope you all agree, of course. So let us make this change together, because we can only do this together with a huge trust towards each other, and if we want to make a change. So I wanted to comment Mr. Chambaki's input, and just to tell him that I didn't expect him to like my report.
Ce débat est toutefois clos.
Well, that concludes this debate. We will be voting on the report tomorrow.
We now move to the Post report, which is... you have the floor.
Solamente quiero denunciar.
President, I want to regret that when we have this very important report drafted by Mrs. Post, and to coincide with this, there is an exhibition that is very stereotypical. It's an exhibition on gypsy people in the Perpignan region, and it really reproduces all those stereotypes. It's very regrettable.
Thank you, Mrs. Ayala Sender. I put to the vote it's the Post report, fundamental rights aspects in Roma integration in the EU.
Pardon? Che cosa c'è? Prego, onorevole.
You have the floor on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. President, colleagues, I'd like to invite everybody to see this exhibition next to the members' restaurant. Thanks to Marine Le Pen, we have a gypsy exhibition here in the European Parliament.
Grazie. Grazie della sua osservazione.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferrand, for that observation. Now, we move to the report, and as I said, this is the Post report on the fundamental rights aspects in Roma integration in the EU. And we'll begin with the vote, and we have paragraph 11, two parts. Part 1, those in favour. Thank you. Those against, abstentions carried. Part 2, those in favour. Those against, abstentions. Let's check. And the vote is open. The vote is closed. Rejected by 3 votes. Paragraph 20, original text, two parts. Part 1, those in favour. Those against, abstentions carried. And part 2, those in favour. Those against, abstentions carried. Okay, we'll check. And the vote is open on part 2. The vote is closed. That is carried. Paragraph 50, original text, two parts. Part 1, those in favour. Those against, abstentions. I think that was carried, but let us check. And the vote is open. The vote is closed. That's carried. And now the second part, those in favour. Those against, abstentions carried. Paragraph 54 in two parts. Part 1, those in favour. Those against, abstentions carried. And part 2, those in favour. You want to check part 1? We can check. It's part 1, and the vote is open. The vote is closed. That was carried, but that was clear to me. Part 2, those in favour. Those against, abstentions carried. Recital I, original text, two parts. Part 1, those in favour. Those against, abstentions. Okay. Okay, one more time. It's recital I, 1, those in favour. Those against, abstentions carried. And part 2 thereof, in favour, against, abstentions. I think that was carried, but let's check. And the vote is open. The vote is closed. That's carried. And now the resolution as a whole by roll call, and the vote is open. And the vote is closed. That is carried by a large majority. Mrs. Soraya Post wishes to speak. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to express my proudness of this chamber today to you who really took your responsibility as politicians to vote in favour for no more exclusion for 12 million EU citizens with Roma ethnicity. It's a good start today to take your responsibility. Thank you very much. And I would also like to thank my shadow rapporteurs, Paul Schacki, Bodil Valerius, Cecilia Wikström and Marina Albiol, and all the people included in this. For me, it is a step forward. Thank you very much.
Grazie. Grazie.